The forest had always been calm, but on that morning it felt strangely still. The wind moved gently through the tall trees, yet no birds sang. Even the leaves on the ground seemed quiet, as if they were listening. A man named Mark walked slowly along a narrow path, carrying his hunting bag on his shoulder. He had been coming to this forest for many years. He knew its sounds, its moods, and its hidden trails. Mark was not in a hurry. Hunting was not just about finding animals for him. It was about being alone, thinking clearly, and feeling close to nature. His life in the nearby town was simple but heavy. Long workdays, quiet evenings, and little conversation had become normal for him. The forest was the only place where he felt truly free. As he walked deeper, the trees grew closer together. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground, creating long shadows between the trunks. Mark noticed something unusual. The air felt colder than usual. He stopped for a moment and listened. Nothing. No birds. No insects. No movement. That made him uneasy. He continued forward, his boots pressing softly against the soil. After a few steps, something caught his eye. A faint shine appeared ahead, hidden between thick bushes. At first, Mark thought it might be an old piece of metal left behind by campers. But as he moved closer, the shape became clearer. It was not small. It was large. Very large. Mark pushed aside a branch and froze where he stood. A helicopter sat deep inside the forest. It looked old and damaged. One of its blades was bent and resting against the ground. The body was covered in moss and dirt. Vines wrapped around its sides like nature had tried to hide it from the world. The paint had faded so much that its original color was hard to tell. Mark's heart began to beat faster. He had lived near this forest his entire life. There had never been any talk of a helicopter crash here. No rescue stories. No news. Nothing. Yet here it was. Silent and forgotten. He walked slowly around it, careful with each step. The ground near the helicopter was uneven, covered with old leaves and broken branches. There were no clear signs of damage from a crash. It looked as if it had landed gently. That made it even more confusing. One of the doors was slightly open. It moved back and forth with the soft wind, making a low sound that echoed in the quiet forest. Mark swallowed hard. Curiosity pushed him forward, even though a voice inside him warned him to be careful. He reached out and touched the side of the helicopter. The metal felt cold and rough under his fingers. He leaned closer and looked inside. The seats were torn and dusty. Dirt covered the floor. A headset hung loosely from one side, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. On the control panel, switches were frozen in place, untouched for years. Mark stepped back. This place did not feel empty. It felt paused, as if time had stopped here and never started again. He looked around the forest, half expecting someone to appear. But there was only silence. The trees stood tall and still, watching quietly. Mark took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell of old metal and earth filled the air. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age. He picked one up carefully. It looked like a flight record. Dates were written neatly, but the writing stopped suddenly in the middle of a page. No explanation. No ending. Mark felt a chill run through his body. He noticed something under the seat near the back. A small bag, dark in color, resting neatly as if placed with care. It was not covered in dust like the rest of the helicopter. That detail bothered him. He crouched down and reached for the bag. His hands shook slightly as he pulled it out. It felt heavier than he expected. For a moment, he hesitated. He had found many strange things in the forest over the years. Old campsites, lost tools, broken equipment. But this was different. This felt personal, important. Slowly, he opened the bag. Inside were several photographs. Mark picked one up. It showed a man standing beside the helicopter, smiling at the camera. The man looked tired but calm. In another photo, the same man stood with a young child. The child's face was bright, full of life. Mark stared at the images. These were not people who planned to disappear. At the bottom of the bag, he found a small notebook. Its cover was worn, but the pages inside were protected. He opened it gently. The writing was clear, careful. The first page talked about weather problems and an unexpected landing. The next pages mentioned waiting for help. The final sentence on the last written page ended with hope. Hope that someone would come. Mark closed the notebook and sat quietly inside the helicopter. His thoughts raced. Questions filled his mind, but no answers came. What had happened to them? Why had no one found this place before? And why did the forest feel like it had been waiting for him? Outside, the wind moved through the trees again. This time, it felt different. Almost like a breath. Mark stood up slowly. He knew one thing for certain. This was not just an old helicopter. This was the beginning of a story that had been hidden for far too long. And he had just stepped into it. Mark stepped out of the helicopter slowly. The forest felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It felt heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. He stood still for a moment, letting his thoughts settle. Finding the helicopter was not part of his plan for the day, but he knew he could not walk away as if nothing had happened. He looked around carefully. The ground near the helicopter showed faint marks, almost invisible under years of leaves. Someone had walked here before. Not recently, but not in a careless way either. These marks were made by someone who had moved with purpose. Mark followed the marks a short distance away from the helicopter. They led to a small clearing. The trees opened slightly, allowing more light to reach the ground. In the center of the clearing stood the remains of a simple shelter. Broken branches formed a weak frame, and old cloth hung loosely from one side. Someone had lived here. Mark's chest tightened. This was no longer just about a forgotten machine. It was about people who had struggled to survive. He crouched near the shelter and examined the ground. He found small stones placed in a line, possibly marking a path. Nearby, there was a fire pit filled with old ash. Rain and time had washed most of it away, but the shape was clear. Mark sat on a fallen log and took a deep breath. He tried to imagine what it must have been like. Alone in the forest. Waiting for help that never came. Days turning into weeks. Weeks turning into months. The thought made him uncomfortable. He returned to the helicopter, this time looking more closely. He searched the storage compartments and found empty food containers, neatly stacked. Whoever had been here was careful. They planned. They hoped. Behind one of the seats, Mark noticed scratches on the metal wall. At first, they looked random, but when he leaned closer, he realized they formed lines and marks. Tallies. Someone had been counting days. Mark counted the marks slowly. There were many. More than he expected. That meant they had survived here for a long time. His mind returned to the photos. The man and the child. The notebook had mentioned waiting for help. But help never came. So they must have helped themselves. Mark wondered if the child had survived. The thought stayed with him as he stepped outside again. The forest suddenly made a soft sound. A branch snapped in the distance. Mark turned quickly, his body tense. He reached for his bag but stopped himself. This was not a threat. It was just the forest reminding him he was not alone. He followed a narrow path leading away from the shelter. The path was faint but clear enough for someone paying attention. It led downhill toward a small stream. The water moved slowly, reflecting the sky above. Mark knelt by the stream and touched the water. It was clean and cold. A good source for survival. Nearby, he found signs of fishing tools made from simple materials. Sharp stones tied to sticks. Clever and effective. The people who had been here were strong. As Mark stood up, he noticed something across the stream. A piece of bright cloth hung from a tree branch. It had faded, but the color was still visible. It was a signal. Someone had tried to be seen. Mark crossed the stream carefully and approached the tree. The cloth was tied tightly, not placed by accident. It had been a message to the sky. He looked upward through the trees. From above, this place would have been hard to see. The forest was thick. The helicopter hidden. The signals swallowed by green. Mark felt anger rise in his chest. Not toward anyone specific, but toward the unfairness of it all. So close to rescue, yet so far. He followed the path further and found another sign. A small carving on a tree trunk. A simple shape. A house. Below it, a smaller mark. A child's drawing. Mark stood quietly. He did not touch it. He did not need to. The meaning was clear. This was not just a place of struggle. It was a place of care. Of protection. As the sun began to lower, the forest light changed. Shadows stretched longer. Mark realized he had been there for hours. He needed to decide what to do next. He returned to the helicopter one last time before leaving. Inside, he carefully placed the photos and notebook back into the bag. He did not want to disturb anything more than he already had. Before stepping out, he noticed something he had missed earlier. A small metal box under the floor panel near the back. It was hidden well. Mark pulled it out slowly. The box was sealed, but not locked. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a recording device. Mark pressed the button. At first, there was only static. Then a soft voice filled the helicopter. A child's voice. The voice spoke calmly. It talked about learning the forest. About being careful. About hope. It thanked the trees for shelter and the water for life. Mark listened without moving. The voice was older than he expected. Not a young child anymore, but not fully grown either. That meant something important. The child had lived long enough to grow. The recording ended with a simple message. If someone finds this, please remember us. Mark turned the device off and closed the box. His heart felt heavy, but not broken. There was strength in those words. As he stepped outside, the forest seemed to relax. The wind moved again. Birds returned with soft sounds. Mark looked back at the helicopter. He knew now that this place was not only about loss. It was about survival. And the truth was still incomplete. He adjusted his bag and began walking back toward the trail. With every step, his purpose became clearer. He would not keep this story to himself. The forest had trusted him with its secret. Now it was time to uncover the rest. Mark did not sleep well that night. The forest stayed in his thoughts long after he returned to his small home near the town. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the helicopter hidden among the trees and heard the calm voice from the recording. It was not a voice filled with fear. It was a voice that had learned how to endure. At sunrise, Mark made a decision. He would go back. Not as a hunter, but as someone searching for truth. He packed lightly and carried the recording device with care. The town was quiet as he drove past old houses and empty streets. Most people were just starting their day, unaware of the story hidden so close to their lives. Mark headed first to the local records office. It was a small building with worn walls and shelves filled with old papers. A man named Tom, who had worked there for many years, looked up as Mark entered. Mark explained what he had found. He spoke calmly, without drama. Tom listened closely, his face slowly changing from curiosity to concern. A helicopter in the forest. No record of a crash. A child who survived. Tom searched through old files. He checked accident reports, flight paths, and emergency calls. Hours passed. Dust filled the air as papers were moved and stacked. Finally, Tom stopped. There was one record. A flight that vanished years ago. It was marked as unresolved. Bad weather. Lost contact. Search teams had looked in the wrong direction. The case had been closed quietly over time. Mark felt his chest tighten. The truth had been close all along. Tom looked at the photos Mark had brought. His eyes rested on the picture of the man and the child. "I remember this," Tom said softly. "The man came here once before the flight. He asked about safe landing spots in case of emergency." Mark asked the question that had been growing inside him. "What about the child?" Tom shook his head. No record of a child being found. That meant the child had walked out alone. Mark thanked Tom and left the office with a heavier heart, but also a clearer purpose. He spent the next few days visiting nearby towns. He showed the photos to shop owners, farmers, and old residents. Most shook their heads. Some paused, trying to remember. Then, in a small cafe on the edge of town, an older woman named Anna studied the photo carefully. "I have seen this child," she said slowly. Mark leaned forward. Anna explained that many years ago, a quiet young person had appeared near the road leading out of the forest. Thin, tired, but standing strong. The child had refused help at first, only asking for directions to the nearest town. No name was given. No story shared. Just gratitude. Mark felt something shift inside him. The child had survived the forest and chosen silence. With Anna's help, Mark followed the trail further. He learned that the child had grown up moving from place to place, working small jobs, never staying long. Always kind. Always distant. It took time, but finally, Mark found a lead. A small workshop in a quiet town far away. A place where someone repaired tools and worked alone. Mark drove there with the recording device beside him. The workshop stood near a river. Simple. Clean. Honest. A person named Liam worked inside, focused on fixing a broken handle. He looked up as Mark entered. Their eyes met. Mark knew. Liam was no longer a child. His face showed strength and calm. But the eyes were the same as in the photos. Mark introduced himself and explained why he was there. He placed the recording device on the table but did not press play. Liam listened without interrupting. When Mark finished, the room was silent. Liam closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "That was me." He spoke quietly, without anger or sadness. He explained how the forest had become his teacher. How he learned patience, planning, and respect. How he waited for days, then weeks, then longer. How he learned when it was time to leave. He walked out of the forest because hope meant movement. Liam said he did not return because the forest was not a prison. It was a lesson. Mark asked why he never told anyone. Liam looked at the river through the window. Some stories need time before they are ready to be heard. Mark pressed play on the recording device. Liam listened to his younger voice without emotion at first. Then his hands trembled slightly. When the recording ended, he took a deep breath. "That voice reminds me who I was," he said. "And why I survived." Mark asked if Liam would return to the forest. Liam shook his head. "The forest did its part. Now it is my turn." They spoke for hours. About memory. About survival. About the man in the photos. Liam said he had left the notebook and recordings behind on purpose. Not to be found immediately, but to be found when the right person came. Mark realized the weight of that truth. He had not stumbled upon the helicopter by chance. As Mark prepared to leave, Liam placed his hand on the recording device. "Thank you for listening," he said. Mark nodded. The story was no longer hidden. But it was not finished yet. Mark left the workshop with a calm mind and a heavy heart. The meeting with Liam had answered many questions, yet it opened new ones. The story of the helicopter was no longer just about discovery. It was now about responsibility. Mark understood that once a truth is known, it cannot be ignored. As he drove back toward his town, Mark thought about the forest again. The tall trees. The hidden shelter. The silent helicopter waiting patiently for years. It felt like the forest had chosen the right moment to speak. Mark stopped his car near a quiet road and looked at the sky. Clouds moved slowly, gentle and steady. He realized that time had softened this story, but it had not erased it. When Mark reached town, he went straight to Tom at the records office. He told him everything. About Liam. About survival. About the recording and the notebook. Tom listened carefully. He did not interrupt. "This needs to be handled with care," Tom said. "Not as news, but as history." They agreed to work together. Not to make noise, but to document the truth properly. Tom contacted local officials and explained the situation calmly. No excitement. No rush. Just facts. A small team was formed. Not for search or rescue, but for record correction. The goal was simple. To officially close a chapter that had been left open for too long. Mark was asked to guide them back to the forest. The next morning, they walked together along the narrow trail. Mark led the way. Tom followed, along with two quiet officials who respected the place they were entering. No one spoke loudly. The forest seemed to accept their presence. When they reached the helicopter, everyone stopped. Seeing it again felt different now. It was no longer a mystery. It was a witness. The team took photos and notes. They measured the area carefully. They examined the shelter, the fire pit, the signals in the trees. Everything was documented gently, without disturbing the space more than necessary. Mark watched silently. He remembered the first moment he had seen the helicopter. Fear and curiosity had filled him then. Now, he felt respect. One official asked Mark if they should remove the helicopter. Mark looked at it for a long moment before answering. "No," he said. "It belongs here. It tells a story better than words." Tom agreed. They decided the helicopter would remain, protected and marked, not hidden but not disturbed. Later that day, Mark returned home tired but satisfied. He sat on his porch as evening came. The forest stood dark and calm in the distance. His phone rang. It was Liam. "I heard you went back," Liam said. "Yes," Mark replied. "We documented everything. Carefully." There was silence for a moment. "Thank you," Liam said, "for treating it with respect." Mark asked the question he had been holding back. "Do you want people to know your name?" Liam thought before answering. "Not my name," he said. "Just the lesson." Mark understood. Days passed. The records were updated quietly. The missing flight was officially closed with truth, not guesses. No blame was placed. No drama followed. But stories have a way of moving on their own. People began to hear whispers. A helicopter in the forest. A child who survived alone. A man who grew strong through patience. Visitors came, not in crowds, but as individuals. They walked the trail with care. They stood quietly near the helicopter. Some left flowers. Some left notes. Mark visited often. Not to guide, but to observe. One afternoon, he saw Anna near the forest edge. She smiled when she saw him. "I always knew that child carried something special," she said. "Now the world knows why." Mark nodded. The forest had changed again. Not in appearance, but in feeling. It was no longer silent because of secrecy. It was quiet because it was at peace. Weeks later, Mark received a letter. It was from Liam. Inside was a simple message. "I am ready to return. Not to the helicopter, but to the edge of the forest. I want to thank it in my own way." Mark felt warmth in his chest. They met near the trail entrance on a clear morning. Liam stood calmly, looking at the trees as if greeting old friends. He did not step inside. He did not need to. "I learned everything I needed there," Liam said. "Now I carry it forward." Mark walked with him for a short distance, then stopped. This was a journey Liam needed to take alone. As Liam walked away, Mark realized something important. The story was never about being lost. It was about learning when to stay and when to move. Mark returned home and sat down to write. Not for fame. Not for attention. But to make sure the story would not fade again. He wrote about patience. About nature. About hope that grows quietly. The forest had given him a purpose he never expected. And the final chapter was close. The morning sun rose slowly over the forest, spreading soft light through the tall trees. Mark stood near the edge of the trail, breathing in the cool air. Today felt different from every other visit. It felt complete. The story that once belonged only to the forest now belonged to the world, but in a quiet and respectful way. Mark walked the familiar path one last time. His steps were steady, his mind calm. When he reached the helicopter, he stopped and looked at it carefully. The moss still covered its sides. The blades still rested in silence. But it no longer felt forgotten. It felt honored. Mark sat on a fallen log nearby and listened. Birds moved gently above him. The wind touched the leaves. Everything felt balanced, as if the forest had accepted its past and released it. He remembered the first day he had seen the helicopter. The fear. The confusion. The questions with no answers. Now those questions had found peace. Later that day, a small wooden sign was placed near the trail entrance. It did not carry names or dates. It carried only words that mattered. A place of survival. A lesson of patience. A story of hope. People who visited understood. They spoke softly. They walked carefully. No one tried to take anything. No one tried to change anything. The forest was not a place of loss. It was a place of strength. Mark returned home that evening and continued writing. He wrote slowly, choosing his words with care. He did not describe fear or pain. He described growth, learning, quiet courage. When the writing was finished, he felt lighter. Days turned into weeks. Liam kept his distance from attention, just as he wished. He did not give interviews. He did not seek recognition. But he did something meaningful in his own way. He began helping others. He worked with young people who felt lost. He taught them simple skills. How to plan. How to stay calm. How to listen to their surroundings and their thoughts. He never spoke about the forest unless asked. When he did speak, his words were gentle. I learned that survival is not only about staying alive, he said once. It is about learning who you are when no one is watching. Those words stayed with many people. Mark visited Liam one final time before winter arrived. They walked near the river, where water moved steadily without hurry. The forest shaped you, Mark said. Liam nodded. And you helped the forest speak. They shared a quiet smile. As winter came, snow covered the trail and softened the forest floor. The helicopter rested under a white blanket, protected by the season. It waited patiently, not for discovery, but for remembrance. Years later, children would walk that path with their families. They would ask questions. They would listen. They would learn that strength does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Mark grew older, but his steps into the forest never stopped. Each visit reminded him that life does not always follow clear paths. Sometimes the most important moments are hidden, waiting for the right heart to find them. One quiet afternoon, Mark sat where he always did and closed his eyes. He listened to the forest one last time. It was no longer asking to be heard. It was simply breathing. The helicopter stood as a silent teacher, not a reminder of fear, but proof of endurance. Proof that even in isolation, hope can survive. Mark smiled softly. The forest had shared its story. The world had listened. And nothing more needed to be said.